All right. So yeah, I'm an artist researcher and a critic, and I've been working at the fringes of indie video games for almost a decade now. And my background is in studying things like history, sociology, and foreign languages. But over time, I became a bit frustrated with the limitations of linear text, and with the need to put ideas in order, like one after another, to tell like one true story about the world. So I started mediating the research I was doing into interactive and tactile forms to try and surface that ambiguity and allow messy things to stay messy. And I was drawn to video games because they allow you to organize information across space and time. And it's a lot like how museum exhibitions arrange objects in a room to help you learn not just through the text, but through the spatial relationships between things. But unlike museum exhibitions, you don't need to be a special authority figure to make a video game. Like, you don't need to have a job that gives you permission to make one. Oh, that's not where I want to be, sorry. So my current project, this is not a picture of that project, but that's how it goes, addresses a social justice issue that's at a crossroads in the UK, with growing transphobic sentiment being expressed in the media and by politicians, and a huge number of transgender people are left in a state of waiting. This is a material issue. People are waiting for access to necessary healthcare and for the ability to participate in like society, and it's all being blocked by bureaucratic processes. But it's also an issue of autonomy. British trans people don't get to exercise the same self-determination and self-definition as trans people in a growing number of other countries. So what's been emerging through the project that I'm doing, interviewing a large number of trans people and making those interviews into interactive media, is actually a lot of different things go into the ongoing construction of our experience of ourselves, experiencing ourselves as gendered subjects or as people who don't experience themselves as gendered. And there are big interconnected issues with lots of different kinds of diversity and even things that don't really have a name yet, like these subtle things about the human experience. And the social and bureaucratic structures of society are going to have to be flexible in response to this ongoing process of making the self in society. And actually, it turns out that none of this is limited to gender. There's this infinite universe of ways of being a person that can't be captured by rigid social structures or by linear stories about the world. But they start to emerge when you let the world stay messy. So to give an introduction to the kind of video games sector that I work in and that I feel really connected to, I wanted to show you a film that I made. I'd made a series of short documentary films traveling down the west coast of North America, talking with people who collect or curate things connected with games. And so this is one of those films. Oh, I need to make sure I'm sharing computer audio. There we are.
I don't know that I can get it across in conversation. Talking with my mother, who is just so anti-video games altogether, and I could explain things for days, and it would not change her mind one bit. Showing her the gallery and showing her the different games, that, made an impact of like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that, this type of experience could be a game. What makes a scene? It's like, what are the components that allow for certain cities or communities to develop these vibrant, creative scenes, versus not. For whatever reason, it's a huge hotbed of game development up here, and I mean, I was like amazed, like when we found out that the Dwarf Fortress guys like were right out here, and we're like, oh my God, we're going to interview the Dwarf Fortress guys. You know, I mean, just all discovering all of these different people that, you know, were in the Northwest, that living their quiet lives, you know, putting out games that, you know, were feeling legendary to me as I was doing this, you know, research. So this, you know, exhibit I opened in November 2014, and so this is an ongoing exhibit that focuses solely on independently produced video games. I want people now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, in the future, to be able to, if they want to, access this material and see what it was like to be a game developer at this point in time. And that idea that, you know, 20 years from now, somebody might be really interested in what that scene was like. And no one is collecting those stories, you know, really. So there's value in, you know, in collecting that, but then also being able to provide access to that. I think people are going to see this gallery as a set of games, but I always want to make sure that the people that are behind it are very apparent. Screens here, which I think there's 45 different videos from different developers and artists and people related to video games. So I always wanted to make sure that those human stories are always forefront of mind. How do I create a space that doesn't read as an arcade, that, you know, offers experiences for people that broaden their idea of what games can be, that, you know, that show that games can be just as powerful experiences as other kinds of media. I do have a point of view, and, you know, the exhibit does need to, you know, to have that point of view, but it's also, that point of view is being guided by every single one of the people that, you know, I talked to through the development of the exhibit. You know, that point of view is tweaked the entire time. It's like, oh, okay, so this, you know, there's a little more nuance here. We're kind of teaching the controversy, I guess. Like, let's put in experiences that people might not even think are games. You know, that just that idea that a game has become something that is, you know, that can have such a broad definition. And to me, I love that. I love that there's all these different kinds of experiences in there. So I think that, you know, there will be experiences in that gallery that, you know, feel like traditional video games, but then there's a lot of things that are really, you know, not that way. I try to always have experiences that kind of feel more edgy or adult, or kind of pushing the boundaries as well. We've had games like Porpentine's Crystal Warrior Kesha, we've had Nina Freeman's How Do You Do It? I mean, the fact that, you know, you are seeing exhibitions on video games is a huge, huge change. I mean, that would have never happened 10 years ago, you know? I mean, it would have never crossed anyone's mind. I think we're at that point where it's like games can be, you know, divorced from that commercial aspect of, you know, the video game industry. And, you know, they can be something else. They can reside in different spaces. You know, this isn't a giant company of 200 people that has $200 million making these games. This is, you know, this could be you making this game.
So although my life now is kind of organized around this whole art practice and connection with indie games, my training was all in the humanities, and my undergrad degree was in Japanese studies. And during my year abroad for that degree, back in 2009, I started doing things with arts and culture at this old folk museum. I wanted to go into museums after graduating, and I reasoned that doing my unpaid internship during a time when I was still getting a grant from the government might be a good way to get around some of the barriers to doing that. When this museum in Japan was first trying to figure out what to do with me, I was given the task of translating this text that they hand out to all the visitors. And this whole text was about who killed who and who invaded which bit of Japan at what time. And none of it was to do with the actual objects. But being in front of the objects was something that felt really significant in a way that this text didn't capture. So that made me really want to explore what I could learn from objects. So if you're a museum and you have something to teach me, why can't you use display to do that, to just like smush that knowledge directly into my face? The more I learned about museums and exhibitions, the more I learned that there is a way of showing this material that puts you in a physical relationship to the object that's relevant to its historical conditions. This is the Victoria and Albert Museum, and they use all of the senses. They use the texture of the material that the objects are placed on, their height, even the smell of the room to communicate something. I decided to do a master's degree in history of design at the Victoria and Albert Museum, so I could learn things from how they do things there. And in some of the seminars for that degree, we were being told that there are some things we can never understand because they're process-based and they're contingent on the conditions in that specific place and time. Like, how did merchants who were connecting the Silk Road to ocean trading routes make decisions about what to buy and sell? And of course, it's true that we'll never fully unpack all of the conditions that led to an object being made and transported around the world. But there's something about that narrative that we can't understand histories that are about dealing with conditions that are in flux that didn't really ring true for me. Because in my private life, I'd been asking myself the question, how can I keep dwarves productive without angering elves? And that's because I was playing this game. This is Dwarf Fortress, which the guy mentioned in the video before. It's an abstract representation of a fantasy system of production, consumption, and trade. And it was forcing me to ask quite complex questions about the ways that different cultures and political forces and natural systems intersect. Also, the V&A master's degree is done in partnership with the Royal College of Art, and I'd started taking on side jobs making dynamic electronic things for some of the proper artists who wanted to have something light up or move as part of their degree show. And I was then, and kind of still am, a total dilettante when it comes to coding and electronics, but it's something I like doing. And there's something about bringing this hands-on engagement with systems into dialogue with research practice that was starting to feel very appealing, but I didn't know at the time where it would take me. So to mix things up, I'm going to jump forward in time a little bit and show you a project I worked on a few years later. This is one of the first video gaming interactive things that I was working on. So I'm just going to open this. I need to share the different screen. All right, is everybody seeing a different screen now? Great, cool. So this is a game called You Were Made for Loneliness. It's an anthology. So lots of different people contributed a piece each to this game. And the main story is about a robot who's been brought in to be someone's house servant. So I'm just going to skip through this first bit so we can get to the bit that I made. Here we are. So sorry, I'm a bit lost now. So I wanted to explore memory as a non-linear thing and have a go at some non-linear non-fiction. So I created this alternative translation of the memoirs of Izumi Shikibu, who lived thousands of years ago in Japan, and wrote these poems when she'd been kind of exiled in disgrace because of her love affairs. And instead of showing them in their usual order, which is more or less chronological, I've connected them by poetic themes. So I was interested in like taking motifs and having her connect between different memories in her head through these kind of touch points, like sleeves brings up one poem and then it connects to another poem for her, which then connects to nighttime, which connects to other poems about nighttime. And so I made this way of like navigating her memory of poems that's non-linear, that is like free association in her mind. And this reflects what I understand to be the kind of system of thought that's important for reading poetry from this time in Japan. Because a lot of these words in poems were used precisely to evoke in the reader's memory all the other times that they'd heard that word used in a poem. So my feeling was that by using a non-linear medium, I was able to directly express something about the nature of the subject matter that's normally only described, and that this is a way that I could be doing history. So back when I was doing that master's degree, I wanted to get historians playing video games and talking about them. And when I brought this up, my supervisor said, well, why don't you just write a paper about a video game? And I didn't even think that was an option at the Victoria and Albert Museum, but it turns out it was. And to relate what I was doing back to that kind of object study that we were being trained in, I looked at video games that have these big, strange weapons in them. The Final Fantasy games in particular are kind of known for their big, outlandish, magical swords. So I just asked, well, why make a sword so big? Why is this one sword made of water? And is this weirdness actually kind of normal if you see it in the right context? It's always dismissed as something that's fake and video gamey and like not quite related to reality. But the more I studied it, the more I found that these objects actually do relate to quite a rich history of extremely large and improbable swords being produced for ritual purposes in Japan. And that got me way more curious about materiality itself. Like, what does it mean for an object to be fake or real within a different material context? And the kind of set texts about materiality that I read as part of that master's degree led me to a question asked by an anthropologist called Tim Ingold to try to provoke people out of getting too comfortable with the notion that everything is just socially constructed. So he asks, well, what if you were a mole and your whole world is about digging holes? Then you wouldn't be thinking about construction, you'd be thinking about excavation, just like the dwarves in Dwarf Fortress digging holes. And what that means is that like the material context informs how our mental constructions happen, and then our mental constructions are projected back onto the material world. So there's a loop between us and the world around us. And I then looked at another video game called Skies of Arcadia, and I looked at the way the materiality of the game and its fiction relates to the world building. A lot of how I understand materials in a video game isn't just about the surfaces of the polygons, but about the ways that materials resist or permit action. And that's a big part of how the medium communicates. There's a sense of bounciness or viscosity or slipperiness that comes from the cybernetic loop between the user and the device, which led me to a question that I'll here phrase as, how can a task be a statement? Which I think is really key to looking at interactive media. And these kinds of questions about materials and mental constructions, tasks and responsibilities and friction have guided a lot of my work since then. So I'm going to show another short video. This is a project that I did in 2017.
I'm doing random reflection.
He doesn't let me, so I'm going to put
Not up my dog.
What?
My dog's not up there.
Why?
He can't get into playing outside. I scolded him.
Why?
He says I'll try harder in the future. I just tried to scold him and something like that.
What?
I'm leaving you to do this.
So that question I referred to earlier, how can a task be a statement, became an even more important question around 2012 as I got involved with the queer games movement, and people were creating these games that represent life paths. So on the periphery of the core video games industry, with which I think everyone has at least a passing familiarity, at its relatively unruly edges is that indie games world that the curator in the film earlier works with. And on the periphery of the indie games world, there's this subculture of queer games. And that kind of scene has been an important anchor for my practice for many years. For many people, video games hold a special affinity because they make transparent some of the ways that who you are in the world are constructed, malleable, and subject to individual agency. This is a transformative idea for transgender people in particular, since all of us have to come to some sort of awakening at some point about this tension between the kind of self-identity we've been assigned for social purposes and our internal sense of who we are and who we could be. I worked on a short film about this with Eden Film Productions a few years ago, which I'd like us to watch now. Oh, I need to change window again.
I was about to put on a sort of face-covering helmet, which is what I usually would wear in that game when I was undead. And I put it on, and then I thought, no, hang on. And I took it off, and I was like, no, actually, I'm going to put on this beret. And I was just a beret. It didn't do anything in particular. So I'm just going to be a weird skeleton creature wearing a beret. You know what? I'm a skeleton in a beret, and I look fantastic. That has obvious implications for how I relate to my own body and my own gender expression in meat space.
For many people, the alternate worlds of video games are the one place where they can be themselves. They're a place where they're in control and where they can try out identities that feel authentic. For other people, video games are escapist fantasies. How do we go from fantasy into reality? And as transgender people who get so few opportunities to experiment with our identities and feel authentic, how do we use video games as a space for shifting from one life into another?
The people I play games with are actually some of the first people I came out to. I think because I knew them sort of almost the most.
Actually trying to play with gender expression in the flesh is expensive, sometimes demoralizing, sometimes you have a cultural taboo on it. There's a knowledge base that you have to learn, which you haven't necessarily been schooled in. Being able to do it in idealized form in a simulation is obviously very useful.
First time I played EVE Online, I thought it was a terrible game and didn't even make it 2 days. But it sounded brilliant, but it was so hard to get into.
Your journey begins by creating the person you aspire to be. Thanks to cloning technology, you can have nearly any appearance you wish. Your avatar makes a statement about who you are and how others perceive you.
So Dark Souls was a game that when I initially played it, it did not occur to me to give the slightest shit about my player body. Suddenly, I related to the game very differently, because when I created a female character and simply called her my name, Lauren, I was shocked to find that I really cared about this human being's flesh. When it was cleaved away, I felt a loss. When I used the resources and brought her back up from the undead into the human state, I was pleased, and then I was scared to lose that, and then when I did lose that, I felt very sad. I felt a real sense of connection to this body.
Meeting Lauren and Louise, I was struck by the different spheres of reality represented by their explorations in game spaces. This is not a binary experience. We construct a performance that's as real or fake as we need it to be, to explore our own lives through flights of fancy or through extensions of our daily lived realities.
I'm sure there are people that use it as an escape, because I've heard of some people always playing female characters, but for me, I never did. I sort of just played whichever character, whatever was going to help.
Although the games I play are classed as sort of role-play games, I don't really role-play. Normally I don't take on a persona when I play games. It's me. The people I play with know me as who I am. Most of them know my real name. I'm friends with them on Facebook and whatnot. Sort of a bit of an escape from things going on at home, because I sort of locked myself away in the bedroom and played them, which is probably why I played them a bit too much.
In some ways, playing that game was kind of a learning experience to me. It did help me kind of find stuff about myself, because I started playing it in a period where I was trying to understand where I was in relation to gender and how I felt with different things. Dark Souls is also actually covertly a dress-up game. It's got all these different outfits, and they can all fit together, and all these different clothes, and they can all fit together in interesting ways. So you don't necessarily have to just wear what's working really well for you and what's going to protect you. You can wear things that you think look good.
For me, it was finding people I enjoyed spending time with that had sort of similar interests, and we did some really cool stuff in that game that I couldn't have done on my own. I could be confident and I could lead a group, but it also sort of learn to sort of trust people.
So I've been questioning and exploring my gender identity for I think about two and a bit years now, and during that time it's gone all over the place, and it's gone through many different permutations and convolutions.
Since you're not going anywhere just yet, let me show you a part of your new life.
Video games have been quite important in the mix of tools which I use to understand how I feel about different things. They've allowed me to explore a lot of different aspects of like what life might be like if I made particular changes. And they have also, on occasion, allowed me just to have an outlet if I'm feeling very dysphoric. Games can be a really good place to get a sense of like synthetic embodiment, which can wash that away for a little while.
Lauren and Louise have both consciously used games, not just as escapes from their real lives, but as settings for meaningful personal growth. The epic space battles of EVE Online and the crushing trials of Dark Souls have acted as spaces for change that would have otherwise been found in the bricks and mortar blood and sweat of bars, nightclubs, churches, schools and universities. Anthropologists like to identify rites of passage, structures in a society that help people to change or to become who they were meant to be. In the 21st century, games are one of those structures. So, imagine how game design might change as people come to recognise how they can help us to develop and solidify our identities. So, people responding to queer games, the games made by queer people rather than just inspiring people, but people responding to games made by queer people often assumed that their value lay in their ability to give an assumed audience of cisgender heterosexual players an experience of being an oppressed minority, like walking in someone else's shoes. And in some cases, this was in alignment with the creator's aims. So for example, Mainichi by Matty Bryce used a game engine intended for fantasy role-playing games to create a simulation of a day in her own life as a trans woman of color in the US. And her stated intent was to create something that could make her white cisgender friend understand why she sometimes seemed sensitive to seemingly small microaggressions. But other designers resisted the idea of their games as machines for generating empathy. Anna Anthropy responded to this reading of her own work by installing at a games exhibition a satirical piece entitled Empathy Game that simply consisted of an old pair of boots and an invitation to walk in her shoes and a scoreboard on which participants would record how many steps they had taken. So this empathy game emphasized how the empathy reading centers the desires and personal growth of a player who is assumed to not already understand the author's experiences, and suggests that their experience has little to do with the content of the story being told and more to do with being able to appropriate somebody else's struggles as some sort of rewarding gameplay challenge. I'd like to show you another game that I made in Twine. In this one, I make up I made up a fake language that feels a little bit like Latin, and you have to pretend to speak and understand this language in order to get medical care from a doctor in hell. So I've got these pieces of this language that I've made difficult to read and kind of intimidating looking and a bit ancient. And everyone's speaking to you in this language that you don't understand. And then the way that you act in this game, the actions that you take, change the kind of being that you're portraying into the world. So the receptionist asks you this question that you don't understand, and you have to choose an answer that you guess might be the kind of thing that you want to say. So I'll stop there rather than do the whole thing. But that game was inspired by an experience that I had trying to help other trans people to navigate problems they were having in the medical system, as I realized that a huge part of accessing quality care relied upon being able to present to doctors as a specific kind of middle-class person. And what I like to do in my work is come up with other positions between self and other. That's not where I want to be yet. So in that game, you're tasked with putting on an unfamiliar affect so that the other person will see you as a certain kind of way. But you don't actually know how the other person might see you. And by using motifs like hell and this scary doctor who turns out to be a dragon, I hope it heightens this sense that what you're dealing with is absurd and a bit paranoid, and it's all fuzzy and like beyond your direct understanding. And the attempt to understand what is going on in someone's head might superficially resemble empathy, but it very easily devolves into a kind of conspiracy theory that's fueled by this unknowability of other people. So I'll show another project that I made. Did I make that a link? No, I didn't. Bear with me. I just need to go get that. But yeah, I wanted to make a project that would explore this like self-other relationship in another way. Right. So here, instead of walking in someone else's shoes, I just want the player to listen to someone. So I did a residency in Japan and I interviewed a dozen trans people while I was there, and I turned each person into a character like this. And yeah, you might notice that it's the same kind of character as the computer petting zoo project that I showed you the video of earlier. And I was really interested in taking that sense of responsibility that people had for how that pet was responding and applying that to other human beings. So you get to choose questions to ask this character. And the answers that come back are directly from an interview that I did with someone in Japan. There's also another side to this project that I haven't written a whole lot to talk about, but I should mention it here. I made custom hardware to display these games on. I know a couple of you actually saw that at Site Gallery last year. And Mark here was really instrumental in making that hardware happen. So yeah, it's really lovely to have people here who are connected with that. So another kind of perspective that I've been thinking about is temporal. How do we position ourselves in relation to time? How do we view the future? So I made a visual essay trying to explore the use of vanishing points in video games and in paintings, because they kind of make me feel like I'm staring down the barrel of the gun of history. So I'm going to show you that here. Mm-hmm.
listening to Night Drive. Thanks for joining us tonight. Almost 100 years before Columbus ever sailed to the Americas, a Chinese explorer named Zheng He made 7 naval expeditions, traveling thousands of miles with over 300 ships. When the next emperor came to power, all the ships were destroyed, and the Ming Dynasty entered a period of isolationism that lasted hundreds of years. With that one decision, the fate of the world changed.
So the queer games movement probably had its peak around the years 2012 to 2014. I think there are alternatives to thinking about cultural movements that way. Like, it's not like everything is a consumer hype cycle. But for now, you can probably accept that that particular moment in time was in some way pivotal. And it certainly was for me. And that was kind of when I developed my own voice as a critic and started exploring the ideas that I now articulate in my art practice. And the queer biographical games made during that time did interesting work to trouble the chrononormativity in how personal life paths are usually narrativized. So for a few years previously, indie games had broadly been using notions of time to tell quite compelling and moving stories. And queer games were then responding to those with stories that reflected different life paths and timeways that had come about in the lives of people who are not cis white straight men. So a guy called Jason Raw made this quite aesthetically interesting lo-fi game using a corridor-like window to portray quite a normative life. A young man finds a wife, he adapts to the constraints and benefits of married life, he gets old and he dies. In Dysphoria, Anna Anthropy portrayed gender transition as a path with a beginning and a middle and an end, where access to trans healthcare is the key to unlocking a better life. The protagonist has a problem, goes through a number of trials, and after overcoming every obstacle placed in front of her, eventually transforms into a body that's fluid and can no longer be bound by the systems that held her back. Matty Bryce's My Nietzsche uses cyclical time to tell a more ambiguous and precarious story about the seemingly intractable challenges that she faces every day as a trans woman of colour. Progress in My Nietzsche only manifests as the player's increased familiarity with the nature of the problem. It's about understanding and noticing life, not about changing it or creating it. So in Dante's Inferno, above the gate to hell, there's a sign that's normally translated as "Abandon all hope, all ye who enter here." But the late media critic Clive James presented an alternative translation. "Forget your hopes, they were what brought you here." So in one sense, hope itself is the cause of suffering. And this is a familiar feeling to me, and I think to many other people. It's impossible to fulfill any normative ideal, and you'll never live up to the idealized version of yourself in your head that you've been hoping for. So this is my work in progress. And it's about that process of finding potentialities and hope in conditions where the future is uncertain, and you're always deferring your life until some unknown date in the future. And I think all of us now have a strong sense of what that's like. When I started this a year ago, it was something that felt fairly specific to the experiences of trans people in the UK. And eventually I hope for there to be 60 characters like this one. I've done 43 interviews so far. And I want to show each of these characters stretched out in a queue to emphasize the scale of the problems that the trans community faces in the UK. We have these waiting times for necessary medical care and legal changes that could be very simple and easy to provide if it wasn't for social controls in place on who gets to be what kind of person. And as you move along the queue, you'll encounter people whose whole perspective on life and what it is to be a person have expanded. And people who are working to build alternative worlds right here in this one, rather than waiting for things to change at some date in the future. So what I'm doing in my art practice is kind of trying to take things apart rather than having to tidy them up into a linear narrative. I'm interested in these vast universes of interconnected ideas and indistinct potentialities. And in the sense that you're encountering knowledge that's way bigger than any one person, bigger than anything you can grasp on your own or fully understand on your own, and understand yourself in the context of a collective that holds all the wisdom we need to get through the problems that we're facing.